some to years in jail. The total number of political prisoners has now surpassed 40,000, according to some reports. The crackdown has forced even a member of the ruling family to defect. RT Arabic spoke exclusively to Saudi Prince Khaled bin Farhan Al Saud, who accuses the monarchy of corruption and silencing all voices of dissent.
The government is obviously scared of the Arab revolutions, and they've responded as they usually do, by resorting to oppression, violence, arbitrary law, and arrest. The easiest thing they can do is deprive you of your salary or fire you altogether. The ruling regime is not guided by justice, and this is especially true of the Ministry of Interior. There is no independent judiciary, as both police and the prosecutor's office are accountable to the Interior Ministry. The ministry's officials investigate crimes, they call them crimes, related to freedom of speech. So they fabricate evidence, don't allow people to have attorneys. Things like that happen all over the place. They even put people under arrest for an indefinite amount of time. Even if a court rules to release such a criminal, the Ministry of Interior keeps him in prison, even though there is a court order to release him. There have even been killings. And as for the external opposition, Saudi intelligence forces find these people abroad. There is no safety inside or outside the country.
Could you describe these people who oppose the royal family, and what are their goals?
Opposition used to demand wider people's representation in governing bodies, more rights and freedoms. But the authorities reacted with violence and persecution instead of a dialogue. Now the opposition wants this regime gone.
We both know that despite numerous human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, your country seldom faces criticism from the West, and from the United States in particular. When senior US officials meet with their Saudi counterparts, do you think they convey any critical comments from Washington vis-à-vis Riyadh?
The White House certainly does maintain a long-standing alliance with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, cemented by common interests in the Middle East. To that end, there are classified contacts between Riyadh and the U.S. administration. In recent time, they have been employed to step up the government-administered reforms. But those reforms are not driven by the elite's desire to empower the people of the kingdom. Instead, they are merely urged by reforms that the regime might fall unless it reforms itself. Oppression is widespread in Saudi Arabia. There is no free speech, no freedom of expression. Corruption is rampant in all areas. From low-level bureaucrats to high-ranking officials, every civil servant is very skillful in using bribes in their operations.
The Saudi regime's crackdown remains largely ignored by the international community, leaving it free to advise other regional powers on how to move towards democracy. RT's Lindsay France takes a look at the country's own dire record of dealing with its own internal democrats.
As Saudi Arabia violently squashes the voice of any opposition, we see it sitting front and center in discussions of the democratic transition of power within other countries, such as Syria. On the one hand, it reportedly ships arms to the opposition in Syria. On the other hand, peaceful opposition in Saudi Arabia is answered with prison sentences, torture, even death for people who voiced their own opinion. In fact, in October 2012, Amnesty International called on the Saudi authorities to stop using excessive force against pro-democracy protesters. Here are just a few examples from this year alone. On June 17th, Mikhlif al-Shamari was convicted of sowing discord and other offenses through writings and exposure of human rights abuses. He got 5 years in prison. June 24th, 7 men were convicted of inciting protests, illegal gatherings, and breaking allegiance with the king, mostly by joining Facebook pages and posting messages. They each got between 5 and 10 years in prison. Then we've got, on the same day, website editor Raif Badawi, convicted of insulting Islam and authorities through his website and during television interviews. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and 600 lashes. In these conditions, anyone with something substantial to say about the government, society, or religion wouldn't be blamed for keeping a low profile. And this is where the man being called the Saudi Assange comes in. No one knows who he is, what he looks like, or where he lives. His prolific tweets denouncing the ruling family as corrupt and enriching themselves from government coffers have earned him over 1 million followers. He is known only as Mujtahid. I spoke with him over Google Chat to find out why he stays in hiding, because it's not for safety. I asked him why he remains anonymous. He said, ironically, anonymity boosts his credibility and encourages people to follow him and talk about his stories without worrying. I asked if this meant that people could pay less attention to his biography and more attention to his message. He pointed out the regime can destroy your credibility easily and deter people from dealing with you if your identity is public. While Mujtahid is forced underground, a new monarchy-backed religious diversity center has launched its own charm offensive in Vienna. According to its mission statement, it encourages dialogue among followers of different religions and cultures. King Abdullah has also announced a donation of $100 million to set up a United Nations Center for Fighting Terrorism. One of its 4 pillars is to prevent conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism and ensuring respect for human rights. So while the king's clerics preach a hardline form of Islam that often becomes a breeding ground for extremism, Saudi Arabia is assuming a moral high ground in advising other nations in transitional democracy.
Well, Saudi activist Hala al-Dosari spoke in detail to RT about exactly what human rights violations are driving people onto the streets despite the fear of arrest.
On the front of human rights in general, definitely we have issues related to basically political and civil rights and freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. This is main issues that causes a lot of people to be at risk for just voicing out their opinions or trying to form association, demonstrate or protest, which is banned by the government. And what we have seen is that there is a proactive move to stifle people from speaking up or gather or at least allowing civil society to create some kind of momentum or push for some reforms.
Well, let's discuss this further with Pepe Escobar, correspondent for the Asia Times, who joins me now live from Hong Kong. Thank you very much for coming on to the programme this morning. There have been protests since 2011 in Saudi Arabia. There have been many arrests since then too, but there hasn't been much global media coverage of this. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, we should break down the strategy of the House of Saud, expanding on what your interviewee said before. Basically, it's carrots and stick. Carrots in the form of a $60 billion handout program by King Abdullah at the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2001. The Saudis were horrified by the beginning of the Arab Spring in neighboring Bahrain. So they bribed their own subjects, number one. Number two, the stick is against the Shiite minority, roughly 10% of Saudi Arabia, who lives in the eastern province. That's where most of the oil is, by the way. They don't want to bring down the House of Saud, essentially. They want more participation, the judiciary not answering to religious powers, and basically more democratic freedoms. This is not going to happen in Saudi Arabia, period. Nor in the other GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, petromonarchies as well. How do they do it? They stoke the Sunni-Shiite divide inside their own country, in Saudi Arabia. They say that these Shiites in the eastern province, they are agents of Iran. They don't recognize that these people have legitimate pro-democracy grievances against a feudal 7th century regime, in fact. So the problem is, in the long run, they're going to have a mini civil war inside Saudi Arabia as well. Just like there is one in Bahrain, which, by the way, they helped spreading the civil war because they intervened in Bahrain for their cousins, let's put it this way, the Al Khalifa monarchy. So it's an enormous hypocrisy. They say to the Americans and they tell the world that they are intervening in Syria for a more democratic Syria post-Assad, and inside Saudi Arabia it's the Sunni-Shiite divide, and they go against 10% of their own population.
And your newspaper is covering this, but why do you believe there is not much global media coverage of this story?
Look, the problem is the Saudi lobby in DC is very strong. So whatever they tell the Americans, and obviously compliant US corporate media, the Europeans are also in the same boat. And don't forget that the Saudis control, I would say, at least 90% of the media in the Middle East itself. The other 10% we can account for Al Jazeera from Qatar. So they tell Middle Eastern publics and Western public opinion that they are on a fight to death against Iranian infiltration or Iranian destabilization. And most public opinion in the West, they buy it. Irrationally, in fact. There's simply no critical analysis of what the Saudis do in the region, what they have done since the Afghan jihad in the 1980s, where, by the way, they helped to destabilize Afghanistan for, I would say, decades. Because they were basically supplying the Mujahideen in the 90s. They were the most radical of them all. Some of them became Al-Qaeda, or what the US tells us is Al-Qaeda, global Al-Qaeda. So they're doing the same thing in Syria. And we come back to the contradiction. Inside Saudi Arabia, the old Shiite generation, they didn't want to bring the monarchy down. There's a very, very strong possibility that the younger generation, some of them unemployed, connected to the internet, on Facebook, on Google, on everything, they will want something more radical against the House of Saud itself.
Do you think
there is an internal problem with the House of Saud, which is the future of the dynasty, which is in jeopardy at the moment.
And do you think those people that are protesting at the moment actually have a good chance of succeeding? Because we hear about the crackdown, but we also hear now there is a new opposition group called the Saudi Million. So despite the crackdown, new protest groups keep appearing. So what do you think the future is for them? Could they succeed, do you think, at all?
Exactly. It's a very good question, because the crackdown is not working at all against part of their own populations. They are in Qatif, in eastern province in Saudi Arabia. There are demonstrations practically every week. There is a very important Shiite cleric, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. He is on trial at the moment. And very, very hardcore Wahhabi clerics in Saudi Arabia, they are calling for his death penalty. If that happens, this is going to polarize the Shiite community as a whole, the old generation plus the younger Facebook, Google generation as well. It's extremely counterproductive, because it's impossible for essentially, it's impossible for a feudal 7th century regime to reform itself. The Wahhabi version of Islam in Saudi Arabia is still 7th century. They will never, never reform, and they will never respect Shiites. They think that Shiites are apostates in terms of Islam.
You say they will never reform.
They are as bad as Christians or Buddhists or Hinduists.
Mr. Escobar, you say they will never reform, but we've you have said there that they will not reform, but we've also seen and heard from the prince that's defected from the royal family. What impact do you think that will have?
Well, that's a very good question, because we are in the middle of the transition in the Das family. King Abdullah, like I remember Bob Dylan in one of his songs, he's not busy being born, he's busy dying. That's what's happening. He's busy dying, and we don't know who's going to be the heir to the throne, in fact. Abdullah would like to put his son. And there's a conflagration between some of the most important branches of the House of Saud among themselves, including some of these, I would say, the top echelon of these 7,000 princes. Some of them, we used to see them in London, you know, when they import their pink Lamborghinis and drive like idiots around Harrods all the time. So some of these are part of the top echelon of the House of Saud. And there is an internal conflagration. So they have an internal mini civil war breeding. They discriminate against their own Shiite population. There's a problem inside the royal family, and they still don't know what they're going to do in the Middle East, even with American support.
We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your opinion there this morning. That's Pepe Escobar, an investigative journalist at the Asia Times, live from Hong Kong. Thank you. Still ahead for you this hour, yanking democracy.